dusty streets of medieval Jerusalem. The crowd parts, revealing people who are known here as living dead. Their faces are hidden under hoods, their bodies disfigured and covered in sores. These are the lepers, as they are called here. Their very presence induces fear, and their touch is considered deadly. But alongside them walk knights with green crosses. They are not afraid. These knights serve those whom the entire world has rejected. This is the Order of Saint Lazarus. In a world where leprosy was considered God's punishment, these people selflessly undertook the most dangerous and altruistic mission. They fought not for gold, not for power, but for those whom even families abandoned to die alone in the dark corners of the city. But who were they really? Why were armed knights suddenly caring for the sick? How did they combine battles on the war fields with compassion, which at times was more terrifying than war itself? Today, we will delve into the history of the order that not only fought, but also saved souls. The Order of Saint Lazarus is not just a story, it is a true legend of the living dead. What exactly was a knightly order in the understanding of that time? The emergence of monastic knightly orders dates back to the time of the First Crusades. The devotees considered themselves soldiers of Christ and combined elements of knighthood, bearing arms, participation in wars, feudal relationships, and monasticism, vows and obedience in their lifestyle. Several dozen different orders were created, spreading their influence from Portugal to Poland. Among the first to appear were three orders, which would become the most powerful of all over time: the Hospitallers, the Templars, and the Teutonic Knights. At the origins of these fraternities were monks and landless knights, who flocked to the Middle East in great numbers at the beginning of the 12th century. In Israel, these people formed communities to help pilgrims and wounded soldiers. Gradually, these communities evolved into knightly orders. Initially, the brothers engaged in pious acts, providing respite to travelers in their fortresses, aiding pilgrims, and treating the sick. Gradually, a caste of warrior brothers emerged within the orders, responsible for protecting caravans, processions, and borders. Sometimes, the knight monks participated in crusades against Muslims, pagans, and even Christians of other denominations. Later, after Jerusalem fell, which we will also discuss today, and the Crusaders were forced to leave Palestine, the knightly orders did not shy away from engaging in usury, trade, and mercenary services. Inside the brotherhoods, there was a strict hierarchy that resembled both an army and a monastery. At the head of the order was the Grand Master, who was accountable only to the Pope of Rome. The Grand Master was not obliged to obey even the laws of the countries in which he operated. Next in line were marshals and commanders, who handled finances and military affairs. They oversaw chaplains and warrior brothers. At the lowest level were novices, new recruits. They were not considered full members of the brotherhood until the ceremony of initiation. Who exactly was Saint Lazarus, and why was the order named in his honor? Here, we should briefly turn to the Bible. Lazarus was the brother of Martha and Mary, residents of the town of Bethany, which was near Jerusalem. His story is described in the Gospel of John. When Lazarus fell ill, his sisters sent for Jesus to come and heal their brother. However, for some reason, Jesus delayed and Lazarus died. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus was already in the tomb, and it seemed that healing was impossible. But Jesus said that Lazarus was not dead, but merely asleep, and praying, he commanded the stone covering the grave to be rolled away. With this act, a miracle occurred. Lazarus was resurrected and came out of the tomb alive and well. The resurrection of Lazarus not only confirmed the divine power of Jesus, but also became a profound symbol of resurrection and new beginnings, which became central themes of Christianity. The resurrection of Lazarus symbolized the victory of life over death and the promise of eternal life through faith in Christ. This moment in the gospel embodied spiritual awakening, healing, and restoration, while also symbolizing support for those in the deepest need and suffering. In the eyes of believers, Lazarus became a living example of how God can turn the most desperate situations into miracles, granting a second life. When the Crusades were at their peak, the Order of Saint Lazarus was founded. Its creation was driven by the need to assist those afflicted with leprosy and to support those whom society had rejected. The Order of Saint Lazarus provided lepers with shelters, hospitals, and medical assistance. And indeed, it was at the forefront of the battle against leprosy. The name of the order was deliberately connected to Lazarus, a symbol of healing and resurrection. The Order of Saint Lazarus became an essential part of the charity system that developed in Europe during the Middle Ages. These knights, like Saint Lazarus himself, were called to fight disease and poverty. One of the main tasks of the order was not only medical treatment, but also providing spiritual and social support to lepers. Lazarite monasteries became centers of care for the poor and sick, and offered a place for prayer and solitude. The fact that even knights and people of high social status joined the Order of Saint Lazarus also holds deep meaning. In this context, the Lazarites became not only bearers of medical knowledge, but also examples of Christian charity and self-sacrifice. They voluntarily helped those who were already considered dead in the eyes of society, and through their service, they brought not only physical, but also spiritual healing. Furthermore, the story of Lazarus has another important meaning in the context of the Crusades and the holy wars of that time. Lazarus was a symbol of those willing to make great sacrifices for their faith, unafraid of death, reflecting the ideal of a knight who, like Lazarus, endures physical suffering but is not afraid to face it. And indeed, many of the knights who joined the Order of Saint Lazarus became victims of the disease itself. Yet this did not deter them from fighting, whether with leprosy or on the battlefield. Thus, the Order of Saint Lazarus became a living embodiment of the ideals inherent in the story of Saint Lazarus, serving the poor and the suffering, striving for healing not only physically, but also spiritually, and combating weaknesses as an essential part of Christian life. In this context, the name of Saint Lazarus became not only a symbol of resurrection, but also an embodiment of Christian charity, courage, and selflessness. To best understand the history of this order, we need to understand the context of the time. Let's immerse ourselves in the environment of that era. Leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, was mentioned in Egyptian papyri, the works of Hippocrates, and the Bible. In medieval Europe, a special liturgical rite of ritual funerals for lepers emerged. A special council of doctors and priests would declare an unfortunate, yet still living person as dead, upon which a symbolic burial rite was conducted. Yes, you understood correctly. They were literally considered dead from the moment the disease was identified. But why did such a practice exist in the first place? The reason was that a person with leprosy was literally doomed to death with no hope of a cure, as there was simply no medicine for leprosy at the time, nor any means to prevent death. Leprosy is a chronic bacterial infection that affects the nerves in the limbs, nose, skin, eyes, and upper respiratory tract. Due to the lack of treatment methods, the disease turned into an epidemic. Those afflicted with leprosy were doomed to suffer horrible torments. Their bodies gradually decayed, the skin rotted, gangrene set in, the person weakened, became blind, and lost the ability to breathe. In the Middle Ages, leprosy was considered a form of God's punishment. The infected literally decomposed alive, dying slowly and painfully. The healthy part of the population regarded the sick with disdain and fear, as medical knowledge about leprosy was a mixture of fact and fiction. No known remedy could help those afflicted, so they were considered doomed from the first days of the disease's manifestation. It's no surprise that the fear of appearing infected was strong, especially in areas with high population density, where the disease spread more rapidly. When the first signs of the disease appeared, lepers were taken to a church and given funeral rites as if they were already dead. After that, they were given special clothing with a piece of red cloth in the shape of a goose's foot sewn onto the chest, as well as a bell. The latter was necessary so that healthy people could quickly get out of their way upon hearing the approach of the sick person. People fled from the diseased in haste, hiding as if from death itself. Such was the fear of contagion. Most often, lepers were kept under supervision in special institutions, leprosariums, which were located outside city walls to avoid contact between the sick and the healthy. Even the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, suffered from leprosy. People claimed that he was incredibly handsome, and contracting leprosy was a true curse for him. The king ordered a leprosarium to be located outside the city, near the gate of St. Stephen. The patron of this shelter was Saint Lazarus, and the Catholic Church has recognized 6 saints with that name. Only knights from military monastic orders could join the Order of Saint Lazarus, but the shelter accepted everyone. The House of Saint Lazarus, one of the most renowned leprosaria, was founded outside the walls of Jerusalem in 1098. At that time, leprosy was a terrible curse that spared no one, neither the rich nor the poor. Infection often meant a death sentence, and the disease quickly claimed lives. The Order of Saint Lazarus began its work amid a horrific epidemic, but soon became an important part of Jerusalem's life. Initially, the Lazarites had no significant resources or influence, but the disease, which spared no one, gave them an opportunity. By the mid-12th century, the order began receiving generous donations from kings, nobles, high-ranking church officials, and even prominent jurists of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These donations included everything that could ensure prosperity: lands, houses, vineyards, crops, and even monetary rents. These resources became the foundation for the order's future prosperity, and its influence in society only grew. However, the most remarkable aspect was that knights from other orders who contracted leprosy often found themselves among the Lazarites. These individuals, understanding that their illness could endanger their comrades' lives, left their ranks and joined the Order of Saint Lazarus, the only one that accepted the sick. The disease had a long incubation period, up to 5 to 7 years, and during this time, knights remained combat capable, not rushing to leave the battlefield. Many continued to serve, keeping the disease a secret until its symptoms became apparent. Additionally, the Order of Saint Lazarus was unique in that only a leper could be elected as Grand Master. This tradition emphasized symbolism. Only someone who had personally experienced divine punishment could lead the order. In turn, this attracted more people willing to give everything for the sake of service. As the number of knights in the order grew, the Lazarites began expanding their military capabilities. Against the backdrop of the Crusades, the order found itself at the center of events. In 1123, a military corps of former knights was established, which became known as the Knights of the Green Cross. This was not just a military unit, but also a symbol of courage, for the Knights of the Order became not only defenders of the sick, but also defenders of the Holy Land. In the leprosaria of the Order of Saint Lazarus, as we mentioned earlier, there were often former knights from other Crusader orders. For example, the Templar rule stated the following: "When it happens to a brother that by the will of our Lord he becomes leprous, and this is proven, the prudent inhabitants of the house must admonish him and urge him to leave the house and go to Saint Lazarus, in order to take on the garb of the brothers of Saint Lazarus." During the Ayyubid siege of Jerusalem and its fall in 1187, instead of peacefully awaiting death at the hands of the Muslims who stormed the city, the Knights of the Order of Lazarus once again donned their armor, took up their swords, and entered the fight, sparing neither themselves nor their decaying bodies. They also participated in other military actions, particularly during the Third Crusade that followed. Noteworthy is the story of how those disfigured by leprosy turned the Saracens to flight in one of the battles. In 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced 2 major crises, internal and external. The internal problem was who would become the heir of the 16-year-old King Baldwin IV, who was gravely ill with leprosy and could not leave an heir. The most likely candidate was the child of his pregnant widow sister, Sibylla. While the kingdom's nobles were seeking a new husband for Sibylla, the situation was complicated by the arrival of Philip of Alsace, who demanded that she marry one of his vassals. Avoiding Philip's request, Baldwin sought to form an alliance with the Byzantine Empire to strike Egypt. While Baldwin and Philip were planning the attack on Egypt, the Ayyubid leader, Sultan Saladin, began preparing to attack Jerusalem from his base in Egypt. In November 1177, Saladin's 27,000-strong army invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin mobilized his forces to defend Ascalon, as he believed it was where the Muslim army would strike. Despite his illness, he set out with 376 knights and several thousand infantrymen. He was also accompanied by Raynald de Chatillon, who had returned from captivity. The Jerusalem army arrived in Ascalon first, but was almost immediately blocked by Saladin's army detachments. Confident that Baldwin, with his small army, would not attempt to interfere, Saladin slowly moved toward Jerusalem, plundering the settlements of Ramla, Lydda, and Arsuf along the way. In doing so, he allowed his army to spread out over a large area. Meanwhile, Baldwin managed to break out of Ascalon, and the Christian army pursued Saladin before he could reach Jerusalem. In the afternoon of November 25th, King Baldwin's army caught up with the bulk of Saladin's forces near the hill of Montgisard. The Sultan later admitted to Saracen chroniclers that he was taken by surprise. Before he could properly deploy his troops, the main forces of the Christian knights, led by Raynald de Chatillon, crashed into Saladin's disorganized army. And, of course, in the front lines stood the troops of the Order of Saint Lazarus. A brutal battle ensued, and losses were great on both sides. However, the Christians managed to defeat the Sultan's forces. Moreover, Saladin himself was very close to being killed or captured, and reportedly escaped on a camel. For most of his army, there was no salvation. Those who were not killed on the battlefield were scattered and found themselves almost defenseless in enemy territory. Although the exact losses at the Battle of Montgisard are unknown, reports show that only 10% of Saladin's army safely returned to Egypt. Among the dead was Saladin's nephew's son. Those who managed to return spoke of the living dead, the fighters of the Order of Saint Lazarus, who had neither fear nor mercy. Survivors of that battle were incredibly frightened, not just by the defeat, but by the fear that the leprous knights might infect them. They were simply terrified to fight against them. Saladin learned from this defeat, and his subsequent campaigns against the Crusader states were marked by much greater caution. However, it wasn't until after the crushing defeat of the Christian armies at Hattin in July 1187, almost 10 years later, that he took his revenge. In everyday life, they hid their disfigured faces under rags. But in battle, the leprous warriors charged with open visors or without helmets, striking terror into enemies who feared infection. It should also be noted that the infected knights were doomed to die from the disease anyway, so they had nothing to lose, and they did not fear death in battle at all, fighting desperately and furiously, often taking the first blow and striving to be at the forefront, both in attack and defense. The fight for Jerusalem, alongside brothers from other orders, became a kind of combat baptism for the Knights of Lazarus. However, the city was soon surrendered to Sultan Saladin to Balian of Ibelin to avoid a large-scale massacre. In the course of these events, the order lost its main hospital and monastery. The contingent of Lazarus knights perished during the loss of Jerusalem. In 1191, King Richard the Lionheart defeated Saladin at Arsuf and captured the port. Along with other crusaders, he negotiated a treaty that allowed the coastal areas to remain under the control of the Crusaders, and Christians were granted complete freedom to visit the Holy Sepulchre. Following the example of other orders, the Order of Saint Lazarus moved to the city of Acre, where they built a hospital, monastery, and churches, continuing to fulfill their hospitaller functions. However, even after the treaty was signed, the Crusaders could not boast of a peaceful life, and soon, just over half a century later, as I will tell you shortly. Now let's move to the year 1239 and look at the events leading up to the final battle for the Order of Saint Lazarus. At that time, a power shift was underway in the Islamic world. Christians took advantage of the turmoil and internal conflicts of the Islamists and formed an alliance with Damascus. The new alliance had its advantages. Damascus confirmed the Christians' rights to the Holy City, and furthermore, some fortresses were returned to the Franks. The kingdom was gradually recovering, returning to the status it held before 1187, before the disaster at Hattin. And it was at this point that the Khwarezmians appeared on the scene. The Sultan of Egypt invited them to Palestine and promised his support. With a huge army consisting almost entirely of cavalry, they attacked the kingdom and brought their women and children with them. Their attack was so sudden that no one could resist them. No one could even foresee it, lamented the Patriarch of Jerusalem in a letter. The Egyptians' plan was simple: to use Khwarezmian mercenaries to crush their Damascus competitor and, at the same time, the weakening Latin kingdom. On July 15, 1244, the Khwarezmians captured Jerusalem. The plunder was easy, as the city walls, demolished under the terms of the previous treaty, had not yet been restored. The churches on Mount Zion, the Temple, and the Valley of Jehoshaphat, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of the Blessed Virgin Mary is located, faced the same fate. In the Church of Bethlehem, they committed terrible atrocities. Their ungodliness cannot even be compared to the infidelity of the Saracens, who always treated holy places with respect. They killed everyone in their path. Even the Saracens were not so cruel. At least, they did not desecrate the sanctuaries and did not kill about 7,000 innocent men, women, and children. Once there was no one left to rob or kill, the Turkmen moved towards Gaza to join the forces of the Egyptian Sultan. The combined army of the Crusaders also headed in that direction. The time for a decisive battle was approaching. On October 17, 1244, the armies met near Gaza at the village of Herbia, also known as Forbi. The coalition forces were led by Walter of Brienne, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon. All the military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and the Order of the Leper Knights of Saint Lazarus joined the forces eager to avenge the desecrated holy sites. The decisive battle that would go down in history as the last battle of the Crusaders in the Holy Land was drawing near. The allied forces of Damascus were led by Al-Mansur Ibrahim, Emir of Homs, and An-Nasir Dawood, ruler of Kerak, which had once been the domain of the famous Reynold de Chatillon. The joint forces numbered up to 10,000 fighters. The Khwarezmians had about the same number in their ranks. The Egyptians brought 5,000 Mamluks from the recently formed Sultan's Guard Corps. Before the battle, a military council was held where Al-Mansur advised not to attack first and to fortify the camp, taking a defensive position. He was convinced that the Khwarezmians would leave after a few days. But how could the Templars and other knights who had come to fight and win be restrained? This was especially true for the warriors of the Order of Saint Lazarus, who had nothing to lose and considered dying for their sacred sites a duty to God. The small detachment of Lazarus knights took their place in the first ranks of the combined forces. The Khwarezmians and Saracens were aware of leprosy and feared the Lazarites. If they didn't die on the battlefield, they might succumb to a deadly disease. Additionally, one of the characteristics of leprosy is the loss of skin sensitivity. In other words, a Lazarus knight, upon receiving a wound, could not feel pain. This was yet another reason lepers were considered living dead. Despite their determination, the upcoming battle promised nothing good for the Crusaders, as the enemy's forces nearly doubled theirs. Nevertheless, the challenge was accepted. The Battle of Forby was lost at the cost of heavy casualties. The Crusaders would never regain their former influence in the Holy Land. All the knights of the Order of Saint Lazarus who went into battle met their deaths. It is believed that the high mortality rate among the leper knights was not only due to their small numbers compared to other orders, but also because healthy individuals feared touching the wounded, afraid of contracting the deadly disease. However, the order was restored. In April 1291, the Saracen army under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil besieged Acre. 5 military monastic orders combined their forces under the leadership of Guillaume de Boja, the master of the temple. The Christian garrison included approximately 14,000 infantry and 700 knights, more than half of whom were members of the military monastic orders. Most of the knights belonged to the Order of the Temple and the Order of St. John, roughly 140 Hospitallers. The other 3 military orders could provide only 50 knights: 25 knights of St. Lazarus, 15 Teutonic knights, and 10 knights of the Order of St. Thomas. The Knights of St. Lazarus joined the Templar Knights in the 4th Defense Sector. Despite the defenders' bravery, the last citadel fell under the furious attack of the Saracens. All the warrior brothers of the Order of Saint Lazarus in Acre perished defending the city. One might think that this was the end for the Order of Saint Lazarus, but that was not the case. Its followers went on to establish numerous leprosariums and hospitals in France and other European countries, continuing to provide aid to lepers. Let's consider the Order of Saint Lazarus not as a military structure, but from a different perspective, looking at healers, the rule, and its fate after the aforementioned events. Let's recall that the order initially only accepted those afflicted with leprosy, and even the Grand Master of the order was a leper, although this rule was later abolished. Their symbol became the green cross. Incidentally, the term Lazaretto originated from the name of the order. The Society of the Order of Saint Lazarus largely adhered to the rule of Saint Augustine. This rule governed life in the order's communities. Like in the statutes of other Christian orders, they valued love for one's neighbor, mercy, a life striving toward God, and harmony with other members of the order, becoming one heart and soul. Resource distribution in the leprosarium was based on the principle of to whom it is most needed, as evidenced by a section of their rule. Do not call anything your own, but hold everything in common. The distribution of food and clothing is to be made by your superior, not equally to all, because not all have the same health, but to each according to his need. For it is written in the Acts of the Apostles, "Keep all things in common and distribute to everyone according to his need." A newcomer to the leprosarium was generally not expected to arrive empty-handed. Given that both the poor and the wealthy resided in leprosariums, they brought practically everything into common use, although there were certain restrictions on the use of items. When those who had anything in the world come to the monastery, let them give something voluntarily to common ownership. When those who had nothing come to the monastery, let them not seek after what they would not have outside of it. You must, nonetheless, provide them with necessary things they need, even if their former condition could not supply their necessary needs. But they must not take joy in finding food and clothing that they could not have outside the monastery. As for the real day-to-day life and organization in the leprosariums, let's delve deeper, as we've touched on this earlier. The architecture of a leprosarium was quite simple and functional. These were usually 2-story buildings with large windows and long corridors. The monks and knights who managed the leprosariums provided the sick primarily with basic living conditions, shelter, food, and medical care. There were often small chapels in the leprosariums where the afflicted could pray and seek forgiveness for their disease. These prayers played an important role in the lives of lepers, as in the Middle Ages, leprosy was often considered a punishment for sins sent by God. The order's mission was not only medical, but also spiritual. Leprosariums became places of seclusion for those who suffered from an incurable disease at the time. In addition to daily medical care, religious ceremonies were held in these institutions, making leprosariums a kind of holy place for lepers. Here, people not only received treatment, but also found solace and support, both spiritual and moral. Interestingly, leprosariums often housed not only lepers, but also others suffering from infectious diseases, such as plague victims. This added an extra burden to the already harsh living conditions in these institutions. It's important to note that treatment in leprosariums was far from modern standards. Patients were often simply provided with food, shelter, and possibly herbal infusions or primitive remedies that, at best, helped alleviate symptoms. The main caretakers and helpers in the leprosariums were monks, often members of the Order of Saint Lazarus. These individuals provided not only medical assistance, but also spiritual support to the sick. Monastic life was not only penitential, but also dedicated to serving lepers, which the order saw as its primary mission. It was a form of voluntary altruism, as even the knights of the order, who had a military past, continued to engage in treating and caring for the sick. Unlike ordinary monks, knights often held a special social status, and their role included organizing the protection of territories, including guarding leprosariums from possible attacks. Monks and knights of the order also organized internal order, maintaining discipline in the facilities. For example, strict rules governed interactions between lepers and outsiders in leprosariums. Contacts with the outside world were limited, and even the personal belongings of the sick were considered unclean. Religious rituals and prayers were regularly conducted to soothe the soul and spiritually cleanse the lepers of their diseases. The Order of Saint Lazarus received significant donations from various rulers and benefactors, which allowed it to build and maintain its leprosariums and provide medical care to the sick. The lands that the order received as gifts were used not only for establishing hospitals, but also for agriculture, which supplied the leprosariums with food. The order also generated income from vineyards, enabling it to function even in difficult times. An important aspect was that many leprosariums became centers of community life. They attracted the attention not only of the sick, but also of travelers and local people seeking help and protection. These institutions were not only places of seclusion, but also centers of charity, symbolizing Christian care for the sick and needy, where people could find support and relief from their severe ailments. Despite its tragic losses and political changes, the Order of Saint Lazarus continued to fulfill its mission of helping the sick for centuries, becoming an important link in the development of medicine and charity in Europe after 1244. Recalling that nearly all the knights of the Order of Saint Lazarus were destroyed, it's logical to assume that after moving to Europe, the order began focusing more on its original mission. Instead of military campaigns and battles, the main focus shifted back to caring for the sick, especially those with leprosy, and the dissemination of medical knowledge. Sadly, although much of the order was restructured into branches of other orders, losing their individuality, the Order of Saint Lazarus, as previously mentioned, greatly contributed to the development of medicine in the Middle Ages. The order began actively working on spreading hospital and medical practices throughout Europe, which played a crucial role in improving the sanitary conditions of the time. For example, it was the Lazarites who began creating a network of their organization across Europe, which later came to be known as Lazarettos. The Order of Saint Lazarus, with its extensive experience in caring for lepers, became an important part of Europe's medical system. The Lazarettos of the order in various European countries played a key role in combating leprosy, as well as other diseases like the plague and other infectious ailments. They actively developed and utilized the latest medical knowledge, which was passed on through their monasteries and hospitals. One of the most important aspects of the order's reform was the creation of a centralized system of Lazarettos, which covered significant parts of Europe. These medical institutions became one of the most well-known symbols of mercy and care for those suffering. The Lazarettos of the order not only treated leprosy, but also provided basic medical care for the poor and needy, positioning the order at the forefront of the healthcare system of the time. The order began actively collaborating with other religious and medical organizations, expanding its reach and offering assistance to both the needy and the poor. Many branches started to intermingle in cooperation with other orders. The first step toward such merging was collaboration with other Christian orders, such as the Order of Hospitallers and the Teutonic Order. These collaborations were not always formal mergers, but rather cooperation towards common goals and objectives. The main reason for combining efforts was one important factor. All these orders shared similar goals, including aiding the sick, defending Christian lands, and upholding Christian values. The collaboration with the Order of Hospitallers was particularly significant. The Hospitallers and Lazarites had similar aims, caring for the sick, including lepers, and preserving and spreading Christianity. Gradually, exchanges began happening between the orders, involving not only material and land resources, but also human resources. Some Lazarite knights joined the Order of Hospitallers, and in return, the Hospitallers helped the Lazarites in supporting their new institutions. Over time, following numerous political and religious changes, the Order of Saint Lazarus gradually became less independent and more integrated into the pan-European knightly structure. By the end of the Middle Ages, with the increasing influence of other orders, the Lazarites no longer played as significant a role in some areas of Europe as they once had, and eventually became part of larger religious and knightly organizations. Thus, the fusion of fragmented parts of the Order of Saint Lazarus with other orders became a logical continuation of its adaptation to new conditions. It allowed the order to survive in the face of changing political circumstances and maintain its role in Christian Europe, even if it meant a partial loss of its original identity. The Order of Saint Lazarus continues to exist today, albeit in a form significantly changed from its early days. The modern order aids the underprivileged in the fields of medicine and education, and participates in humanitarian missions, upholding Christian traditions of mercy and helping those in need. One of the main tasks of the order is also to assist alcoholics and drug addicts. To join the order, one must be a Christian Catholic and have a recommendation from an existing member. The symbol of the order remains the green Maltese cross.